Jens Kamp and Paul Longley. And this research is funded by Economic and Social Research Council and Transport for West Midlands. And I just think it's very thankful to Transport for West Midlands, both funding this research and providing this data source in the granularity and extent that they have, because it's been a really interesting thing to work on over this time period. So I'm looking at accessibility and public transport and how the mobilities of vulnerable groups move around it. So my main research wasn't necessarily, I mean, of course, none of it was around the COVID pandemic, but I was looking at public transport, mobility and equity. So looking at how different groups get to use public transport, where they go and what they do. And particularly because of the data set from Transport West Midlands is English National Concessionary Travel Scheme users, so people pension age or eligible disabled, looking at how these groups' mobilities are represented throughout the system. What's been particularly hard in my research to disentangle is the fact that this transport is induced demand. So you have all these people making these trips along these lines that have existed for a long period. And what the pandemic created is, in a sense, a kind of experiment type scenario whereby I've been looking into these issues of transport captives, and as outlined by Being Born in 2003, so people who might not be able to choose mode, but who are instead confined to using one. And I'd always been interested in how this related to the network of public transport itself. So how these journeys of people are facilitated by it or not facilitated by it. With the lockdown, what this created was essentially a situation in which only essential travel was allowed. So these restrictions and how they were reacted to by people is really visible in the data set that we have. So, and yeah. So I've got this data from Transport West Midlands. They're the transport authority that covers the entirety of the West Midlands combined authority. There's 2.9 million people living in this area. You've got major cities of Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton, but also loads and loads of urban coverage and smaller towns and urban centres throughout this entire place. So it's quite a varied and polycentric organisation of cities with rural space, especially between Solihull and Coventry, and also really intensely urban areas in different parts of it. The red outlines on this image are around the local authorities themselves. So some of them correspond to individual sorts of city systems like Coventry and Wolverhampton, but others like Birmingham, Sandwell and Dudley have loads and loads of conurbations of different towns within them. So all of this mobility that I'm going to be tracking happens within the system of public transport. And so it was really important to get a baseline of where these buses and public transport systems are going, and so be able to work out what aspects of this transport use are by transport captives or are directed by the ability to get places. So there's two sets of data I use the accessibility analysis. One is the public transport timetables, so TransExchange downloaded all the bus routes, and the other one is the point of interest data. So to represent accessibility for essential travel, I used basically local shops and high streets. So it's a supermarket data set and it's high street locations. I'll talk about that later. But here we go. These are all the centroids for the area, for the output areas coming here. So I calculated the accessibility for each of these output areas because I can link it up through to other geographies of census data like LSOAs and other administrative boundary areas. But also it's more densely packed in more dense areas. So where there are more people, you get more information. And it's quite, yeah. And is also they're population weighted, so they should be over where people are. So the accessibility rating should have some relevance to where the people are. And then the destinations I worked out for where people were to go to is from two data sets. One is the Geolytics retail points data set, so it's an open one. And that's got basically a list of all of these supermarkets across, I don't know the extent, I think it's at least all of England, but people will be able to correct me, I'm sure. But I just cropped it for this area. And then what I noticed is that that coverage was mostly for the bigger branded supermarkets. So I enriched this data set by adding high street retail center locations from the CDRC data set. So where there might be a high street that probably has a supermarket on it, but it might not be a branded one that's captured in the data. So on this map here, you've got, there are 494 points, 79 of them are outside the bounds of this actual map, but they represent 442 supermarkets and 52 high streets. And what I did with this data is using Open Trip Planner, I took each individual output area, like the blue dots in the middle, and worked out the trip time by walking and or public transport from each point to the 10 nearest in Euclidean distance of these destinations every 10 minutes throughout the day, 8 AM to 8 PM, and then took an average of this time for each individual output area. So in the next slide, I've mapped this data here, so you can see the accessibility travel time, which quite closely mirrors basically the density of urbanization and buildings over this space. So in spaces in the center of town where you might have less people, you still have very high accessibility. And you can see the band of the rural countryside between Soil and Coventry showing a really long travel time, which actually is quite understandable because the technique will sort of put a point down, link it to the nearest possible road, and then work out a walking time, which in the countryside might be a while, and people there may well just use private cars. But this displays the kind of the background that the mobility I'm looking at happens within. So all the data I have is based on using this bus network, basically. And so I want to understand what parts of the mobilities of individuals are directly sort of created by the bus network and what parts are due to them and the difference between it. So the novelty of this analysis, or the newest and most exciting part, is using the transaction data for Transport for West Midlands I've shown here. There's two main parts to it. One of them is a record of every single transaction that's been made. I've got it from 2011 to 2020, but in this case, we're just looking at 2019 and 2020 because we're looking at pre-pandemic year and then the first pandemic year. And so that's about 90 million transactions in that data set. And then alongside that, I also have a cardholder register, which is anonymized data, but it still has gender, ethnicity, postcode, and date of birth. So actually it's held in the UCL data safe haven because it's safeguarded, it's secure data. And so I have to access that using quite a stringent process, but it does mean that there's some really interesting levels of information that can be pulled out of this data by linking the two together. So there's about 400,000-ish active accounts in the data set over the whole time period, maybe more like 500,000. And that's what I was saying. Oh yeah, so the headline numbers of transactions is in 2019, there are about 60 million transactions. And in 2020, there are about 27 million transactions. So in effect, I'm saying, where have these transactions gone and what kinds of people have disappeared from the data set and what kind of people have stayed? So in order to do this in a way that's easy to communicate and quite simple, we basically, one thing I should have said earlier on is that a lot of this work I did in partnership with Fionn Carney, who's another researcher who's moved on now to private sector. And yeah, so I'll flag up the bits of work that she did on this because it wouldn't have been possible without her. It's very good. One of them is this discussion about the segmentations. So categorizing the 2019 mobilities of these individuals in our system by how frequently they use it. So we tried out various different methods, but eventually settled on this one because it was actually the easiest one to explain and use, whereas if you end up with programmatically created clusters, sometimes it can be quite difficult to categorize and use them. So what we've got here is how often they use their card on an average week, or how often they use their card each week, taken as a mean for the whole of 2019. So you can see the biggest group there is the rare users, and we've got 52,000 in there. So that's people who use it less than once a week on average. So they could have just used it once in the entire year, or they could have used it maybe 51 times, but once a week. Second one is infrequent, so between 1 and 2. Then you've got frequent, which is 2 and 3. You've got regular, which is 4 to 6, and daily, which is 7. But daily as a category, this could be someone who just uses it 7 times a day, 7 times a day, once a week, if you get what I mean. So it's not necessarily corresponding to someone using it every single day of the week, but corresponds to someone who uses it a lot, basically. And in this data set, so what I'm showing you here, the numbers is 152,000 people or individuals who are active in 2019 and 2020. So there are about 220,000 people active in 2019, but we didn't want to falsely include people who had stopped using it before the lockdown, basically. So these are people who, active in 2019 and 2020. They're not necessarily the whole way through 2020. So we wanted to use some simple criteria to basically flesh out this idea of transport captives. So who are individuals in this data set who live in areas of low accessibility, but are still continually using public transport the entire time throughout the essential travel only period. So what we did is we found individuals who lived in output areas of that took on average over 15 minutes to get to the nearest supermarkets or high streets, and also people who returned to their 2019 segmentation. So returned to this table here, at the same place they were between the initial lockdown date and the 15th of June, when non-essential travel was allowed again. So we are finding out who has returned to what they were doing before, who never stopped doing what they were doing, and which one of those people lived in a low accessibility area. So about 62,000 returned to exactly the same level they were in before, and about 3,500 of these live in low accessibility areas. So in this, we have found, a group of about 3,500 people who live in what we consider to be a low accessibility area by public transport, and also who are still heavily using public transport all throughout the lockdown period, or at least return to it within it. And then what I've got here is a map of the percentage of public transport captives by LSOA, so low super output area. So this is of the cardholders in our data set, so the 152,000, what percentage of them are public transport captives? And what you can see here, I'll get rid of the labels there, is that you have these kind of pockets, especially around northern Birmingham, the city, sort of behind that label there, and also in Wolverhampton, of these concentration of areas where you have these public transport captives. But this sort of spatial organization is not necessarily as interesting as seeing the underlying patterns within the sort of demographics. So who is a public transport captive, rather than just where do they live. So Theon Carney ran a logistic regression to interrogate this aspect, and the results of that are here. Sorry if it's intensely boring to look at, but basically what you can see, and I'll run through it, is that the logistic likelihood that someone is or the likelihood that someone is a public transport captive is what we're modelling here. So when you look at the age, you can see, for example, that against the lowest age group we have, which is 66 to 70, as you go up the age groups, people become less likely to be public transport captives. And what that we think that may refer to is there are still lots of people of working age, or people who are still employed in that lowest level age bracket. So it may be the case that these individuals are simply using their public transport to continue to get to work. We also found quite a large difference between the expressed genders in the data set of males returning to being more likely to be a transit captive than females quite heavily. And then another interesting point of this research is the huge disparity between ethnicities in this group. So as you can see, with the reference group as white, because it's the largest group in the data set, you can see that the Asian people within the Asian ethnicity within the data set are less likely to be transit captives, and people who are black as their ethnicity are much more likely to be transit captives. Then in the next bit below, you can see the segments. So more frequent users are more likely to be transit captives, which I guess would be, it just shows that the less frequent users are transit captives. And then the other part of this is that when we looked at the LSOA level information, so for example, the IDA OPI, which is the old age income based deprivation decile system, which is slightly different to the index of multiple deprivation, where it's looking at things that specifically affect older people, because that is the population in our study. You can see that the less deprived you get, the less likely you are to be a public transport captive. And then finally, we've got the percentage of car owners, which is an interesting one within this, because it basically shows that within areas with a high percentage of car owners, you actually have high levels of public transport captives. So this may show a bias towards places with lower accessibility, because sometimes we will choose to live in places. You may already know that you have a private car and you're not necessarily interested in public transport. You're not interested in accessibility, but it could show that within these groups of people, or within these locations, there are people who are highly dependent on the buses. And whilst they may not be the biggest group, it is something to look out for in terms of the social exclusion of these people who might not necessarily be considered as deserving of public transport accessibility, because often people look purely at issues of deprivation without considering the sort of perhaps hidden needs that there may be within geographies or groups of people. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much. There's a slide there of my GitHub, Twitter, and email, and I'm happy to provide the presentation slides at the next time as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Alfie. Yeah, thanks very much, Alfie. I think that was wildly interesting. Lots of things happening using and lots of work that I think went on in this project, especially linking all the data together and linking it further to using these open trip planner. Lots of work, very interesting. I already saw there was a question in the Q&A. We'll keep the questions to the end for everybody who will tune in later. And we're going to now make the transition from talking about buses and public transport towards a different type of mobility. And we're going to talk a little bit about bike sharing. So with us will now be joining James Todd. As I mentioned earlier, he's also a PhD student at the Department of Geography, and he's going to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns on the London bike sharing system. So a little bit more mobility in London, and this time from the bike perspective. So I'm going to give the floor once again to James to get talking.
Okay, hello, can everyone hear me? Sweet, and hopefully you could all see the slides as well. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Justin, and thanks for everyone for turning up today. My name's James Todd. I'm a part-time associate lecturer at UCL as well as a part-time PhD student here. And as part of my PhD research, I've been looking at the impacts, or well, more generally, I've been looking at the utility and validity of bicycle sharing system data, primarily relying on dock capacity data to create various different heuristics for global comparisons. More recently, my research has focused on assessing the impacts of COVID-19 lockdowns on mobility patterns within specific systems, like the London bicycle sharing system here, which I would like to present to you about. So within this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the context of COVID-19 and bicycle sharing systems, and then go on to give you a general sort of descriptive summary of the trends observed during the various different lockdown periods. And then the last few slides will focus on some of the more technical spatio-temporal and network analyses that I conducted in order to be able to quantify the changes that have occurred as a result of the lockdown restrictions imposed on the country. So, setting the scene, we have this general narrative that bikes and bicycle sharing systems more generally are a good thing during lockdowns. They essentially enable people to conduct socially distanced forms of exercises. And so there are many news articles that have appeared over the past few years that indicate that there have been a strong increase in the uptake of cycling during the pandemic period. And like I said, that's most likely a function of the fact that these modes of transportation are individual and they enable you to be active in a time where you're forced to stay at home. And there's been a lot of investment in bike share infrastructure recently from the likes of the Mayor of London, like Sadiq Khan, who's been heavily invested in increasing the amount of cycling infrastructure that is available to the public within this time as well. And within this context, I was interested in understanding whether there was actually this significant increase in uptake during lockdown periods, and how these activities presented themselves across the lockdown periods as well. So in order to conduct this analysis, I used two primary data sets, the first of which was the London bicycle sharing system journey data. Now, this is essentially just origin destination data, which enables me to identify the origin dock and the destination dock, as well as when that journey happened. And then in conjunction with that bike share journey data, I've been using the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker dataset, which was created by a team of researchers at the University of Oxford. This dataset contains 23 indicators of government response from over 180 countries around the world and has been updated daily since January 2020. And so it gives us a very holistic picture of the various ways in which nations and regions have been imposing various different restrictions on their populations in an effort to help curb the COVID-19 pandemic. And for the purposes of this analysis, I've been using that data in order to help identify enforced periods of lockdown. So within the Oxford COVID government response tracker dataset, they have a stay-at-home indicator, which is an ordinal scale from 0 to 3, 0 indicating no measures, 1 indicating recommended stay-at-home measures, and those levels 2 and 3, which indicate enforced stay-at-home periods, which I take to be lockdown periods for this study. And what I want to show you now is just those general trends which were observed across from the beginning of 2020 to the summer of 2021. And the graph I present to you here is just the general sort of activity trends that were observed in the Google mobility dataset, so those colorful lines that you see, which are slightly transparent in the background, in comparison to the London bike share system activity that I calculated using the equivalent period in 2019 in order to get the percentage difference in activity. The slight difference between the Google mobility data and my change in activity data is the fact that my baseline is based on the 2019 equivalent period for as its baseline in order to be able to capture seasonal variations, whereas the Google mobility dataset only uses 5 weeks worth of data from the start of 2020. And so, yeah, the primary difference between the two is this baseline period, but it enables us to get a good understanding of how bike share activity has changed throughout 2020 and 2021 in comparison to other modes of transportation or other sectors of activity as defined by Google. And what we tend to observe within these grey lockdown periods, those vertical grey areas indicate the lockdown periods. So the first one, we can see that there is a significant decrease across the board in all sorts of activity areas, but the most affected areas are those workplaces, retail and recreation, and transit stations, which see 70 to 80% decreases in activity. What's interesting to observe is that there are similarities that we can see between the London bike share activity and the activity observed in the parks sort of category from the Google mobility dataset. This may be indicative of cycling activity being uptaken within these green spaces, but hopefully the analysis that I'll present in future slides will help to detangle this relationship between the two. Another interesting point to note is that towards the end of each of these lockdown periods, we tend to observe a decrease in the compliance of restrictions per se. So more people are returning towards the end of the lockdowns, which you can observe in both lockdown 1 and lockdown 3 there. So just to sort of summarize all of those sorts of points into some nice, simple percentages, what I've done is created this table here to give you guys a picture of the general trends that we're observing within each of these lockdown periods. So in lockdown 1, during the weekdays, we observe a 50% reduction in the number of journeys. This is opposed by an increase in the number of journeys that are observed during the lockdown period on weekends. And this sort of pattern is observed throughout the lockdown periods as well. So generally, we can see that weekdays see a significant decrease in the number of journeys, whereas weekends see a significant increase in the number of journeys. And we can try to observe how these changes manifest within the system. So this is just a simple GIF that I created a while ago and sort of initiated my intrigue within this area of how activity patterns have changed during lockdown periods. So on the left-hand side, we have an understanding of the changing nature of the distribution within the control period in 2019, where we can see during the working hours, there is a strong concentration of bicycles within the center of the system. And then outside of those working hours, those bikes then disperse back out to the periphery of the system. So we have this kind of concentric in and out sort of heartbeat to the system. This is contrasted by a much more varied and random nature of journeys that you can observe within the lockdown period, where we can see very little activity occurring within the center of the system. And so through using spatio-temporal analysis and network analysis, I hope to be able to quantify these changes within the bike share system and how those activities present themselves. So in terms of spatio-temporal analysis, I first aggregated the number of journeys that occurred during each hour of the day within both the control and the study period. So in this graph here, I'm presenting the control period in 2019 for lockdown 1 in comparison to, which is this strong bold red line, in comparison to the weekday equivalent in lockdown 1 in 2020, which are these dotted lines. And those are for the weekdays, and then in blue are the weekends. And we can clearly see that there are vast differences in the temporal patterns of these journeys occurring within the system. So the most obvious is that within the morning commuter peak at around 8 AM, we see an 85% decrease in the number of journeys in lockdown 1 in comparison to the control period. And then the sort of evening commute home peak at around 5 PM, we observe a smaller but still significant 53% decrease. This is again contrasted by an increase in activity that is observed during the weekend patterns, which is highlighted here, where we see a 71% increase at the 2 o'clock peak. And we can sort of see these changes are consistent throughout the different lockdown periods that have occurred in London. So similarly for lockdown 2, we can see those significant decreases in the morning peak as well as the evening peak during the weekdays, and we also see a significant increase during the weekend peak. And again, similarly for lockdown 3, we see similar sorts of trends here as well. And then what I wanted to do was get an understanding of how these changes present themselves spatially as well. So where are these journeys occurring and how does that compare to the control period? So this map presents those aggregated journey origins within H3 geometries at the 8th resolution, which is about 450 meter edge for each of these hexagons. And that's just to enable me to get a better understanding of the distribution of journey origins within the system. What we're able to observe generally is that during the weekday, these decreases tend to occur within the center of the system, as was identified with the GIF that I previously showed you. And towards the periphery of the system, we see an increase in activity. This is again contrasted by a more general increase throughout the weekend, where we see decreases within the center of the system, but generally across the board, we do see increases emanating out from this center. What I wanted to do was to highlight where these sorts of changes are occurring. And so I've pinpointed some locations on the map here. So on the left-hand side, I've highlighted some key commuter stations, which are vital to, so the bike share systems are vital to solving the last mile problem. So individuals who travel from afar, commute into the city to these stations typically use bike share as a means to get to their offices and their final destinations. And what we tend to observe is that around these major commuter stations, there are significant decreases that have occurred during the weekday patterns. So this is in lockdown 1. In comparison, for those weekend patterns, we typically observed activity to increase around those green spaces. So we've got Hyde Park and Regent's Park, where we see significant increases in that level of activity. And this is probably synonymous with an increase in uptake of bikes as a means of exercise or leisure within these green spaces during the lockdown period. What's also interesting to note is that within the center of this, we see a decrease, which is associated with the area of Oxford Street, Soho, Tottenham Court Road, which is sort of a retail area within London. And so we can see that these retail activities do have a decrease within the weekend patterns that are observed. And essentially what we're able to do is compare how these changes in journey origins present themselves in different lockdown periods. So we see similar patterns in lockdown 2, where those areas surrounding the commuter stations, we see significant decreases, whilst those areas around the parks, we see significant increases at the weekend, and similar sorts of stuff for lockdown 3 as well. And it's all well and good being able to sort of observe and understand those relationships spatially and temporally, but I wanted to be able to quantify those changes using a more sophisticated sort of analysis. So I employed some network analysis techniques in order to do that. So first, it was important to set up my graph in order to be able to analyze them. And so I created a graph for the control period as well as the study period, the associated study period. So the equivalent lockdown 1 to the lockdown 1 period in 2020. And for each of these, the nodes represent each docking station, the edges represent the origin destination journeys. These edges are weighted based on the number of journeys that occurred within each lockdown or associated control period. And then these are also directed as well. I know where they started and where they ended, as opposed to not knowing which way around they were. And what I'm going to do is present a few network statistics that hopefully demonstrate how these changes present themselves within the network structure. And so the first sort of general network measure that I wanted to present to you guys was the number of edges, which is the number of unique origin destination pairs. And generally what we see is that across lockdown periods, we see a decrease in the number of unique origin destination pairs during the weekday, but we see an increase during the weekend. So this suggests that during weekdays, there are fewer commuters because there's less variety within the whole system, whereas in comparison within the weekdays, we see more, a greater variety of journeys within the whole system, which is likely indicative of those new journeys occurring within the sort of green spaces that were observed in the spatial map that I presented earlier. The next sort of measure that I wanted to present to you guys was edge variation, where we're able to observe an increase in the average journeys per edge in both the weekdays and weekends. So this suggests that although journeys are decreasing during the weekday, we tend to see an increase in the variety of journeys that do occur. So there's more heterogeneous journey activity that's occurring in both periods, which is indicative of just more varied journeys in general. And the final measure I wanted to present to you was a measure of sort of clustering within the network. And what we tend to observe is that node preferences decrease, indicating that journeys tend to occur more randomly as opposed to more directed commuter trips or more directed trips in general throughout both weekdays and weekends. So we go from this more sort of clustered assortment of docking stations to a more randomly dispersed distribution of journeys within the system. And so all in all, that sort of indicates that although there are decreases during the weekday and increases in activity during the weekend, we are able to understand that generally journeys generally are more varied in nature throughout the entire period. And this is likely indicative of new users uptaking cycling as a mode of leisure and exercise during times of lockdown. The final sort of bit of analysis I wanted to present to you guys was sort of supplementary to the network analysis, where I was able to calculate docking station importance using centrality betweenness, as well as use some community detection measures in order to identify the communities that are present within the docking, within the bike share system. And what we observe is that within the control period, the docking stations within the center of the system here are very important, depicted by their size. So they're larger in the middle, and we see four major sorts of communities. There's a northern community, an eastern community, a southern and a western community. What is interesting to observe is that, first of all, the the sort of docking station importance within the center of the system decreases within the lockdown period, where only those docking stations in close proximity to green spaces, like those around Hyde Park and Regent's Park here, present themselves as still being very important. Again, indicative of leisure activity during the lockdown period. The other interesting thing to note is that there is an emergence of a sort of large community of activity occurring along the eastern half of the river, contained within the bicycle sharing system. And this is likely indicative of leisure activity, again, occurring within this cluster along the river. So yeah, all in all, we've been able to learn all the intricacies about the London bicycle sharing system and how they have been impacted by the London lockdown. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'd welcome any questions.
All right, thank you very much, James. Well, firstly, I think it's time for a digital round of applause for both of our speakers. That was very interesting. Thank you very much for being here and talking about these using these large-scale data sets in the context of mobility. Very interesting. We do have some time for questions, so you can either post a question in the Q&A for either Alfie or for James, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute your mic so you can actually ask the question without typing. There is a question for Alfie in the chat. I know that he has been answering some during, but the question there is that Alfie, thanks for the interesting talk. And he got a question maybe beyond the scope of your presentation. There are many declines in bus use during the pandemic. And have you thought about looking at how different groups of people might return to use public transport? We might soon to be in recovering phase of the pandemic. And do you think any particular age or initiative group might re-embrace bus quicker than any others? Alfie, do you have any comments on that question?
Yes, I do. And I promised this question was not a plant, but already have some research underway to look at this. So using survival analysis techniques to model how quickly people returned and basically calculating hazard ratios to these individuals. I've yet to submit the paper, but it'll be coming out soon. I think that is a really interesting point to raise, and I would love it if anyone's got any other suggestions of how it might be possible to model that, because yeah, the recovery phase is really interesting. Who will come back, who can be tempted back, who can't be tempted back, who needs to be back and who doesn't need to be back, basically. Very interesting questions. My current data set ends at the end of 2020, which is where the analysis has ended for now, but we are looking at getting more data from there. And I think yeah, watch this space, because something very exciting to do with survival analysis is coming, basically.
All right, thanks, Alfie. I hope that question got answered. So there's another question in the Q&A. This is by Nick, and it's a question for James now. And Nick is wondering, please, could you say a little bit about how you modeled the route of the bike journeys?
Cool, thanks for the question, Nick. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because within all of the analysis that I've presented today, I've never actually modeled the actual routes that each of these journeys have taken. So within the context of, say, the H3 analysis, I was just looking at the journey origin, so I wasn't modeling any sort of journey route there. And also within the network analysis, all I'm interested in is the origin and destination locations, as opposed to the routes taken in between them. And so, yeah, I haven't taken that into consideration or modeled it within the analysis that I've presented here.
All right, thanks, James. There's one question in the two questions for James, actually. I'll just try to combine it. So the first one might be a little bit out of the bicycle share, but is there a certain using e-bikes? Can you comment on that? Or is the classic bikes are more popular? Might relate to other type of cycling higher. So I'm not sure if you can comment on that. And then there's another question asking like, could you explain why the fewer unique origin destination connection was interpreted as fewer commuters rather than anything else? Because intuitively, I would say that commuting yields many overlapping rather than diverse trips. Into the chat.
Cool. Thank you very much for both of those questions there. In relation to understanding the relationship between pedal bikes and e-bikes within the bicycle sharing system, the Boris bikes that are around UCL, all of them are pedal bikes. None of them are electric bikes as of yet. And so I'm not making any comparisons between the two. Within some of my other research, I have been considering looking at the presence of e-bikes and how they compare to their pedal bike counterparts. But I'm in the very early stages of conducting that research. And so generally what I tend to observe is that within systems where there are significant topographical difficulties, so big hills within the city, e-bikes tend to be dominant and see significant uptakes in comparison to those pedal bikes. So trying to answer the other question, could you explain why fewer unique origin destination connections are interpreted as fewer commuters? Yeah, I like that point actually. I think intuitively, I would think the same as well. Looking at the sort of graph structure holistically, what we observe is that during commuter hours, you're right, commuting activity tends to occur from these large transit hubs to concentrated central business districts where these offices tend to be located. And so generally, what we observe is large volumes of journeys occurring between two docking stations per se. What tends to happen during these peak hours is that docking stations tend to fill up very quickly. So this is Waterloo Station is the typical example that I like to give, where operators are constantly having to refill the station just because commuters coming off the train are taking them out at such a rapid rate. And so what we tend to observe is that during these peak commuting hours, users have to sort of very strategically vary the docking stations that they go to depending on where the spaces are located, because more often than not in these sort of destination locations, they tend to be full. And so as a result of the reduction in activity during those commuter peaks, there is a synonymous reduction in the number of unique origin destination pairs during these peak times as well. So hopefully that sort of answers the question there.
All right, lots of questions for James. And meanwhile, I will sneak in a question for Alfie myself, just to allow James to have a quick look at the other questions directed to him. Personally, I was wondering in Alfie's presentation. So the work involves a lot of, I think, involves the concessionary travel smart cards, as far as I understand it. So it's a particular demographic. So do you think there's I know you don't particularly have data on other age groups, for instance. Do you think there will be a similar pattern in terms of captivity and with, for instance, in terms of which areas are more captive to the public transport system and the different types of users? Can you just give a bit of an idea about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Justin. And I don't know if I can say, because I think this was a really specific point about this is a group of people who are likely to be retired and were also advised to stay at home during this period. And so I think what there may be, I wouldn't want to draw out too many comparisons between what general activity levels are like, but I think maybe that would be a good thing to look at, perhaps another avenue of research to check that out. But these relationships of deprivation and disparities between ethnicities and how that relates to accessibility does appear to carry across into outside of these groups. But I wouldn't want to comment on quantifying that because I haven't looked at the actual data itself. But yeah, I think that would be really interesting to look at.
All right, thanks, Alfie. We're slowly approaching the end of the hour, so I think there is one follow-up question by Nick and two more questions for James, which talk about the technique to collect the data, some more on the network analysis, and the comparison to the Google data. If you can briefly comment on that still, James, and then there is one last question after that for Alfie as well.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll try and speed through all of these questions. So Suze, in relation to, no, that was for Alfie, sorry. Where was the question about data? Chloe, sorry. Sorry, I can't. In terms of collecting the data were made available by TfL. So they routinely release clean journey data sets on their API. So they're freely available and open to the public. The dot capacity data that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation was collected by one of my colleagues at the CDRC, Oliver O'Brien, and he's made a few of those data sets available on the CDRC data website if you wish to explore those in the future. Nick, in relation to edge analysis. So edges, in reference to this presentation, just refer to the links between each of the nodes within my graph setup for the network analysis. And Morgan, general activity trends were interesting. Can you comment more generally on people's responses? It seems much of the movement drop-off had already occurred before lockdown. Yeah, so I'd agree. I think it's very difficult to be able to sort of identify when these changes occur and sort of why. Within the graph that I presented at the beginning of my presentation, talking about the sorts of general activity, what we tended to observe is that activity started to drop right at the beginning of March, even though the lockdown restrictions were only imposed on the 23rd. And generally that's understood as being like fear mongering and people sort of generally trying to limit the amount of activity that they conduct. In terms of the sort of return to normality towards the end of each of these lockdown periods, that's typically because, well, I assume these are primarily because individuals sort of see that end sort of cut-off point and they feel a little bit more relaxed, and as sort of the number of cases go down, people feel more open and able to partake in previously sort of dangerous activities. Yeah, but I'll be happy to discuss that more another time.
All right, thanks, James. Then I think there's one last question for Alfie to round up this session. So Alfie, this is Shu asking, did you have to find and import your own bus timetables, or are they already imported in OpenTrip Planner for all of the UK? So more on the data side of things, Alfie.
Hi there, Sue. Yes, so I did use my own, but this is because I've been modeling historic usage since 2015. So I had to get historic data that isn't available widely, but I do have it for the entirety of the UK. So if anyone is interested, I can send it to them. It is an open government license that holds it. But what I will say is there's a new bus open data service from which you can download the GTFS data. I did build the OpenTrip Planner instance myself and use that to carry out my analysis because the amount of stuff I was running through it. But I think there should be easier ways to do it, and if you send me an email, I'll be happy to respond to that, to point you in the direction of whatever you might want to do.
All right. I think with that we have come to to the end of this first session webinar of the year. There will be more planned. Keep an eye on our Twitter or on our mailing list, and you will get all the information you may need. We are also currently the GIScience research group is also currently looking for proposals for sessions for the annual conference. So if you have any questions, please send me an email or look at our website, look at our Twitter. And with that, I just want to thank everybody who has tuned in, and particularly I want to thank both of the speakers for these very interesting stories. Yeah, so thank you, and see you all in the next webinar.